Joe Schilling. It's unclear whether 31-year-old Justin Balboa knew that he was blocking a walkway during a night out drinking with friends at a bar in Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 2021. He was talking with his group when MMA fighter Joe Schilling tried to get past him. In a video of the encounter, Balboa appeared to take a step toward the professional kickboxer. Then, reacting with lightning speed, Schilling immediately began to throw punches, knocking Balboa unconscious. And as a result, the injured bargoer was hospitalized with a head injury. It's clear, based on the footage of the incident, that Schilling is a much larger man than Balboa. Despite his advantageous size, he claimed that he acted in self-defense and that he feared for his life when he knocked Balboa out. Schilling also accused Balboa of hurling a racial slur at him before things got physical and said that he had taken action against the evil in this world. Balboa filed a $30,000 lawsuit against Schilling for battery and against the bar for negligence. And in 2023, a Broward County judge ruled in favor of Schilling under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows a person who feels like their life is in danger to take whatever action is necessary to neutralize the threat. The court also granted Schilling immunity from allegations of negligence and battery in connection with the case. But this wasn't the first time that Schilling made headlines for hitting someone in public. 3 years earlier, in 2018, he beat up a homeless man after catching the vagrant doing something inappropriate in the bathroom of his gym. Footage posted to the fighter's Instagram account showed Schilling throwing the man onto a sidewalk, battering him with a backpack and kicking him. The much smaller and clearly terrified man could then be seen trying to run away as Schilling tossed him around like a ragdoll and cornered him. In a follow-on video, Schilling explained that he was infuriated because his gym is family-friendly and it was no place for what he walked in on when he entered the bathroom. He said that the homeless man had snuck into the gym to use the shower, which didn't really bother him, even though the man was trespassing. When the visitor turned off the shower though, Schilling began banging on the door in an attempt to get him to leave. But the man refused to exit the stall and screamed at Schilling, who continued knocking on the door. And when the man finally opened the door, Schilling realized what had been taking him so long. It's unclear whether the police were called, but it appears as though no charges were ever pressed in regards to the case. 7. Michael Barisone. Former Olympian Michael Barisone was known internationally for being one of the world's best dressage riders. If you've never heard of it, dressing is an equestrian sport involving a series of fancy steps and moves. It's almost like a dance and is considered by some to be an art form. Dressage is extremely difficult to master and requires both a good relationship between horse and rider and complete control of the horse's movements at all times. In 2018, an aspiring dressage rider named Lauren Kanarek, her 2 horses and her fiancé Robert Goodwin moved on to Barisone's farm in Morris County, New Jersey. Kanarek wanted to learn from the best, and her wealthy family was willing to pay top dollar so she could dedicate herself full-time to the sport. But the young woman was dissatisfied with the amount of time Barisone devoted to coaching her. He had other students and Kanarek had expected more one-on-one sessions. She was also upset with the fact that the training sometimes involved working with other coaches, even though they were highly skilled and perfectly qualified to teach. Kanarek began expressing her frustrations on social media, and during the summer of 2019 the tone of her complaints escalated. The disgruntled student accused Barisone of being racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic, and while Barisone's many friends and supporters knew that this wasn't true, the allegations still put his reputation in jeopardy. He began to fear that the slanderous rants would ruin his business, which had worked incredibly hard to build, and he slowly began to unravel mentally. In another post, Kanarek wrote, "It's about time to possibly go to war. Anyone who repeatedly kicks a resting beast will eventually wake her up." Barisone would later tell 48 Hours that he asked Kanarek and Goodwin to leave his property, but that they refused. At least 4 911 calls were made during that summer as the feud intensified, with Barisone telling law enforcement that he feared for his life. But the police classified the dispute as a landlord-tenant issue to be resolved in civil court, and the warring parties were left butting heads on a sprawling farm that had become too small for them both. The hostilities reached their breaking point on August 7th of 2019, when Barisone shot Kanarek twice in the chest outside his farmhouse where she was living. Goodwin tackled Barisone to the ground, while Kanarek mustered up the strength to call 911. Police arrived at the residence to find Goodwin on top of Barisone, while Kanarek bled profusely from life-threatening injuries nearby. Kanarek was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She was put into a medically induced coma and managed to pull through after fighting for her life, but she faced a long road to recovery. And in the meantime, authorities charged Barisone with 2 counts of attempted murder. Barisone's attorneys accused Kanarek of wearing down the trainer's mental health until he lost touch with reality. He claimed that he didn't remember committing the shooting, and his lawyers urged the jury to find him not guilty by reason of insanity. For all intents and purposes, Kanarek was a victim, even if her behavior was maddening. But Barisone received a lot of support from family, friends, fellow athletes, and equestrian colleagues, who all said that the shooting was extremely out of character. They believed that there might have been extenuating circumstances for Barisone to have taken such drastic measures, and the jury ultimately agreed. Insanity rulings are extremely rare, especially since they spare defendants from prison time and typically don't come with fixed sentences. But the jurors concluded that Barisone was temporarily insane and therefore not guilty for shooting Kanarek. He was ordered to undergo inpatient care at a psychiatric facility until doctors conclude that he's no longer a danger to himself or others. But as of 2023, he remains in treatment. And a court hearing is scheduled toward the end of the year to check on his progress. 6. Deadly garden hose dispute. In 2020, a man in his early 70s named Rodney John Lee began complaining about his neighbors at a public housing complex in Melbourne, Australia. And it started with his frustrations over loud music and alcohol consumption in communal areas that were shared by residents. Lee's grievances became even more frequent the following year, when he began accusing a new neighbor of cooking and selling drugs. His inability to get along with community members reached a boiling point in early 2022, when Lee became angry with neighbors for turning off the tap to a garden hose that he was using to water plants outside. He'd left the hose running while he stepped into his apartment, and when someone saw that the water was turned on for seemingly no reason, they turned it off. Lacking the patience for a civilized discussion about the issue, Lee screamed at his neighbors, who were in the middle of a social gathering, and threatened to kill them if they turned the hose off again. And during that same altercation, he also hit one of his neighbors with the hose. But it really bothered 62-year-old Salmoto Gazio to see water being wasted, and he felt strongly enough about the issue to turn the hose off again when he found it running and not being used for a second time. So, when Lee erupted into his second rampage of the day, Gazio simply explained that he didn't believe in wasting water. Lee called Gazio a worthless human being, prompting Gazio to ask Lee to leave the gathering. The irate senior citizen then stepped back into his apartment, retrieved a gun, and charged back outside. And with the weapon now in his hands, he shot Gazio in the arm and chest. As Lee reloaded the gun, Gazio and another neighbor, 57-year-old Tibor Laszlo, fled into a nearby apartment. But they were unable to escape the barrage of gunfire, and Lee shot both men. Laszlo was fatally struck in the chest while tending to Gazio's injuries. Lee surrendered himself to authorities shortly after the double homicide, and he owned up to his actions in court by pleading guilty to both murders. Lee was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with a minimum of 24 years. But at 74 years old and in poor health, he'll likely die behind bars before he ever sees freedom again. During Lee's sentencing, the judge acknowledged that the defendant had taken responsibility for his crimes, but he criticized Lee for failing to express remorse and for claiming to be a victim who was provoked into taking deadly action. 5. Contentious co-parenting clash. After calling it quits on their relationship, Edmundas Daugsa and Ingrida Makiokite remained committed to giving their daughter a stable upbringing. The little girl lived with her father full-time in the Irish city of Dundalk, but she still saw her mother on occasion. And the arrangement seemed to be working out well until September 2018, when Ingrida petitioned the court for primary custody and won. The hearing lasted just 4 minutes. It certainly wasn't enough time for both parties to argue their cases, and Edmundas was devastated by the decision. So, in the days following the ruling, he took pills and drank alcohol to cope with the emotional pain of his daughter's absence. And when Ingrida refused to drop the child off for a planned visit with Edmundas just a few days later, he reached his breaking point. Armed with a knife, he went to Ingrida's apartment complex to discuss the issue. At some point during the argument, Edmundas pulled out the knife and stabbed Ingrida 19 times in the courtyard of her building. She died from her injuries, which included at least 1 stab wound to the heart and 3 or 4 to the lungs, and as a result, Edmundas was charged with murder. During his trial, he admitted to the fatal stabbing, but the defense argued that the circumstances surrounding the case should be considered as mitigating factors in determining the defendant's conviction and punishment. Edmundas's lawyer described his client as distraught and destroyed as a human being after losing access to his daughter. And the defense further argued that Edmundas felt railroaded by the family court system with good reason, and urged the court to consider the possibility that he'd been provoked by Ingrida's refusal to let him see their daughter. But these pleas for sympathy failed to sway the jury into a position of leniency, and Edmundas was convicted of murder. During his sentencing hearing, the judge pointed out how his decision to grab a knife and take it with him to the crime scene didn't show the kind of loss of control that's typically required under the legal definition of provocation. So, Edmundas was sentenced to life in prison, and his daughter lost both parents as the result of his decision to resort to violence. 4. Police-involved shooting sparks Parisian protests. 2023 has been a rough year for France when it comes to civil unrest. From January to March, a waste workers' strike caused weeks' worth of garbage to pile up on the streets. And 4 months after the strike ended, the death of a young civilian at the hands of a police officer triggered violent protests throughout the country. The upheaval began after a delivery driver named Nahel Merzouk was shot dead by law enforcement in the Parisian suburb of Nanterre. Police initially claimed that Merzouk, who was of Moroccan and Algerian descent, was driving at them when they decided to use deadly force. But the incident was captured on camera, and the footage appeared to show that Merzouk had been shot at point-blank range while attempting to drive away from officers during a traffic stop. At the very least, the video told a much different story than the narrative that was offered by police. After the clip surfaced, French President Emmanuel Macron condemned the shooting as inexcusable. Merzouk's death sparked some of the country's worst protests in nearly 2 decades in terms of their geographic period. Over a 5-night period, demonstrators burned at least 2,000 cars and trashed hundreds of public buildings. And as a result, authorities arrested more than 3,000 people in connection with the widespread disorder. The last time France saw rioting on this scale was in 2005, after 2 teenagers were fatally electrocuted while hiding from the police. Much like the protest that occurred after Merzouk's death in 2023, the earlier demonstrations erupted in the suburbs outside France and other major cities. Known as banlieues, these often poverty-stricken communities are home to many citizens of African descent. Evidence suggests that young non-white people in banlieues are up to 20 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white civilians in more well-to-do neighborhoods. It's a problem that people have long been aware of, but because France adheres to a so-called colorblind attitude toward race and ethnicity, no official data has been collected or analyzed. Without accurate information, there's no way to gauge the true extent of the disadvantage that minorities experience. And without knowing how severe the inequality is, it's impossible to plan an effective response to it. After 5 nights of civil unrest, the protests following Merzouk's death finally calmed down. But as the bigger issues surrounding the riots continue to go unaddressed, the likelihood of future protests remains ever present. 3. Competition between co-workers. On what began as a normal morning in April 2022, police responded to an emergency call at a farm equipment yard outside Bakersfield, California. Officers arrived to find an employee, 56-year-old Hector Javier Castaneda Vasquez, lying on his back with massive injuries to his head and face. And unfortunately, he was declared dead at the scene. Vasquez had been bludgeoned to death with a metal pipe by his co-worker, Jose Luis Gutierrez Rosales, who fled the scene before law enforcement arrived. But 10 days later, he was apprehended in connection to the crime. The victim and the defendant had worked together for 3 years leading up to the murder. Shortly after his arrest, Gutierrez Rosales told investigators that his co-workers had made fun of him because of rumors that Vasquez was sleeping with his ex-girlfriend. The taunting was later described as persistent ridicule and bullying. Unable to cope with the humiliation in a rational way, Gutierrez Rosales snapped and brutally beat Vasquez to death. He also admitted to telling the victim, "This is for getting involved with my family," when he made the fateful split-second decision to resort to violence. Detectives interviewed the ex-girlfriend, who said that she and Gutierrez Rosales had dated for about 3 months before going their separate ways a few weeks before the attack. The woman told the police that her ex had anger issues, although by that point this was fairly evident. A jury then convicted Gutierrez Rosales of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. 2. Convicted creep versus irate inmate. After serving as the team doctor of the United States women's national gymnastics team for 18 years, Larry Nassar was criminally charged with assaulting hundreds of clients. The true extent of his crimes and the exact number of his victims may never be known, but it went on for years. In 2017, Nassar was convicted in both federal courts and Michigan State Court on numerous counts. He received a 60-year federal prison sentence along with 2 state sentences, one for 40 to 125 years and another for 40 to 175 years. His state sentences will run consecutively to his federal prison sentence, ensuring the disgraced former physician never sees a single day of freedom again. In 2023, Nassar was stabbed 10 times by a fellow inmate at the Coleman Federal Prison in Wildwood, Florida. A source told ESPN that Nassar suffered at least 2 stab wounds to the neck, while the rest of the injuries were to his back and chest. The 59-year-old was rushed to a nearby hospital where he received treatment for his wounds. Another source identified the attacker as 49-year-old Shane McMillan, who had previous convictions for assaulting a corrections officer and the attempted murder of a fellow inmate at the notorious Supermax prison complex in Florence, Colorado. The insider told the Associated Press that McMillan was angered by a lewd comment Nassar made while they were watching women play tennis on TV, and the attack happened later on inside Nassar's cell. The outcome of the assault may have been much different if 4 inmates hadn't rushed into the cell and pulled McMillan off of Nassar. Corrections officers also responded to the chaos and performed life-saving efforts on Nassar while waiting for the ambulance to arrive. But this wasn't even the first time Nassar was attacked while in custody. At the beginning of his sentence 5 years earlier, in 2018, he was assaulted within hours of being released into the general population at a penitentiary in Arizona. It's likely safe to assume that the nature of Nassar's crimes made him a target for other inmates. An investigation later concluded that Nassar couldn't be housed safely at the prison, so he was shuffled around for the next few months before landing at the facility in Florida. Then, shortly after the 2023 attack, authorities announced that Nassar would be relocated once again. 1. Henry Morales. High school sweethearts Henry and Melina Morales married shortly after graduating in 1997. They moved from Toronto to Ecuador for a brief period before returning to Ontario and settling down in the city of Brampton. Then, in 2005, Melina traveled to Ecuador for a family event. But when she returned to Canada, she confessed to Henry that she kissed an ex-boyfriend during her trip. Henry was hurt and upset, but the couple decided to stay together and move past the incident. When Melina's beauty salon business failed in early 2006, she and Henry decided to move back to Ecuador. Melina went ahead with their 2 children, while Henry stayed behind to sell their house and tie up loose financial ends. When Henry arrived in Ecuador, he learned that Melina had lost money in a bad investment, so he attacked her at his brother's house where the family was staying at the time. Henry's brother kicked him out after the violent fight, and he once again headed back to Canada. Melina and the children soon followed, and the family shared an apartment for a short period. But by then, the couple's marriage was falling apart. They were fighting constantly, and in May of 2006 they decided to separate. Hoping to make the marriage work, Henry persuaded Melina to reconcile, and the couple bought a house, but things didn't get better. Then, less than 2 months after separating and getting back together, the pair got into an argument over money and whether they could afford their next mortgage payment. Henry would later claim that Milena slapped him and told him that he disgusted her. She also asked her husband how he could promise things to his family that he was unable to provide. According to Henry, his wife admitted during the disagreement that she didn't love him anymore and that she only agreed to give their marriage a last-ditch effort because she wanted a house. Milena then allegedly said that she was leaving Henry, that her ex-boyfriend was going to replace him, and that she was taking the kids and Henry would never see them again. Unable to contain his rage, Henry strangled his wife to death, and by the time Milena's body was found, he was long gone from the scene. Milena had multiple injuries, including 5 broken ribs and a head wound, and before fleeing the scene, Henry addressed her in her pajamas. He then took their sons mini-golfing, and afterward he dropped them off at his brother's house before leaving for Mexico City, where he remained on the run for years to come. The search for Henry became frustrating as time dragged on, especially after an America's Most Wanted segment dedicated to the case failed to yield any major leads. Authorities finally tracked down Henry in 2019, and he was extradited to Canada to face justice. In his 14 years on the run, he had remarried, had more children, and landed a career as an English teacher. During Henry's trial, he claimed that he didn't remember the attack, but he insisted that he didn't mean to kill Milena, and that when he realized what he'd done, he was horrified and devastated. Henry's attorney urged the jury to consider her client's alleged lack of intent, and that if they decided that the intent was there, to consider whether Milena provoked her husband's deadly outburst. It would mean the difference between a murder conviction or a lesser manslaughter charge. Under Canada's provocation clause, a jury must rule that a defendant acted unlawfully, but understandably, to a sudden wrongful act or insult. According to the Toronto Sun, Henry's lawyer reassured jurors that this type of ruling wouldn't mean that Milena was any less of a victim, but that her husband lost self-control during a moment of extreme anger. Unswayed by the defense, the jury convicted Henry Morales of second-degree murder, and as a result, he was sentenced to life in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 15 years behind bars.
Number 8. Omari Garland. In a disturbing act of violence that was captured by a doorbell camera in July of 2022, a suspect was accused of assaulting and robbing a 70-year-old Asian American man as he arrived at his home in Fairfield, California. Identified by police as 30-year-old Omari Garland, the masked thief could be seen rushing up to the victim and ordering him to hand over his belongings at gunpoint. The senior citizen yelled inside his house for help as he fell to the ground and was pistol-whipped repeatedly by the suspect. And as the victim's adult son ran outside to help him, the thief grabbed the victim's phone and ran off. Police identified and located Garland's vehicle using California's anti-crime detection system and arrested him on suspicion of felony robbery. Several weeks later, he allegedly targeted another Asian American man with hateful behavior at a martial arts gym. According to an Instagram post by the Train for Life gym in Sioux Sun City, Garland threatened to beat down his much smaller victim. At the time, it was the gym's monthly sparring week, and unbeknownst to Garland, the man he was picking on was a professional MMA fighter named Terrence Wrong Turn Saturn. The employees let the two men spar, and Garland didn't even last the entire first round. He called time out with a minute and a half left on the clock. In a video of the sparring match, the person filming could be heard saying, "You come into my gym, you call out the smallest guy in my gym, and now you want to call a timeout?" The owner then kicked Garland out of the gym and posted a video on social media, using it to emphasize the importance of self-defense training. Number 7. Texas mom teaches her son a lesson. When a mother from Splendora, Texas received reports that her son was bullying other kids in September 2018, she made him wear a t-shirt to school that had "I am a bully" written on both the front and back in large letters. Known only by her first name, Star, the no-nonsense parent posted a photo of the embarrassing ensemble on social media, but it generated a lot of negative feedback from people who thought she was being too harsh on her son, and she ended up deleting the post. Speaking with ABC 13, Star said that she heard that her son was calling his classmates names like stupid and idiots. She unapologetically described herself as an old-school parent, adding that she doesn't coddle her children or sugarcoat the world to them. Starr insisted that she wasn't trying to embarrass her son by posting the photo of his "I am a bully" t-shirt online. She claimed her intention was for the post to serve as an apology to the parents of any kids he may have bullied. Despite the disapproving feedback the post received and her decision to delete it, the old-school mom shamelessly stood by her disciplinary decision. She said that her son learned the intended lesson from his punishment when he said that he didn't like how he felt wearing the shirt and that he didn't want anyone else to feel like he did. Child psychologist Dr. Richard Pesikoff told ABC 13 that he understood why a parent would be upset with their child for bullying, but that the t-shirt could do more harm than good. He recommended that Starr speak with her son's school counselor for advice on how to handle these situations, but Starr said that she'd already had that conversation and that the counselor supported her decision. Number 6. Eric Ronald Bolduan. Between late 2015 and late 2016, at least 4 female college athletes in Colorado endured a relentless campaign of torment at the hands of a married man from Rochester, Minnesota, named Eric Ronald Bolduan. During that same period, authorities believe the former Rochester, Minnesota resident may have targeted as many as 50 victims across the United States. Bolduan superimposed the women's faces on photos of naked bodies and posted them on adult websites along with the victims' names, personal information, and clothed photos from their social media profiles. He also allegedly emailed the material to the victims' professors, family members, and fellow sports team members. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Bolduan's goal was to make it look like the women were promiscuous and involved in creating adult content. He threatened his targets with extreme violence and death while using a device to keep his IP address anonymous, describing in disturbing detail what he planned to do to the recipient. In one message, Bolduan told a woman that he wanted to bash her head into the floor until her teeth fell out. And another email urged the victim to go along with his demands because he planned on forcing her into submission if she resisted or refused. Bolduan also threatened to hunt his victims by learning their habits and routines. Following his federal arrest for stalking and making interstate threats in 2017, Bolduan reportedly told an FBI agent that he has performance issues in the bedroom that cause him to lash out at women. He also allegedly admitted that he acted with the intention of making the victims fear for their lives. Bolduan pleaded guilty to stalking and making interstate threats without a plea agreement in place. He was sentenced to over 14 years in federal prison and is slated to be released in 2029. The true number of Bolduan's victims may never be known. In 2022, he admitted to stalking a 5th victim in Boston, Massachusetts, and as a result, he was ordered to concurrently serve a 2-year sentence along with his current term. Number 5. Chainarong Marijan. After a night out partying in Bangkok in early 2022, 25-year-old Paraploy Saia stopped at a street restaurant for something to eat. A man later identified as 35-year-old Chainarong Marijan approached her and tried to clink glasses before asking for Paraploy's phone number. The young woman rejected Chainarong's advances, and he didn't take it too well. Video of the encounter showed Chainarong walking back over to Paraploy's table and pouring a pint of beer all over her. He was apparently unaware that Paraploy was a Muay Thai champion with dozens of national awards under her belt. And in response to Chainarong's rude gesture, she stood up out of her seat and challenged him to a fight. Chainarong quickly realized his mistake and fled the restaurant, but Paraploy caught up with him and continued to give him a well-deserved dose of karma. She verbally berated Chainarong and swiftly delivered a series of kicks to the body. Paraploy also managed to get a right hook in before her friends pulled her off the regretful creep who shamefully walked away from the situation. Chainarong apologized for his actions, but his employer refused to overlook the incident. He was reportedly fired from his job, and both he and Paraploy were fined 500 baht for their behavior. Number 4. Ryan Cherwinski. 21-year-old Amelia Holden was working as a waitress in Savannah, Georgia in 2018 when a man later identified as 31-year-old Ryan Cherwinski walked by and grabbed her backside. Footage of the encounter showed Holden putting Cherwinski into a headlock, slamming him against the wall and throwing him to the ground. One of Holden's co-workers called the police, and Cherwinski was arrested the next day on suspicion of battery. News sources later revealed that the father of two from Palm Bay, Florida, was at the restaurant with his girlfriend of 11 years, Erica Martin. Holden told Inside Edition that she couldn't repeat most of the things she said to Cherwinski as she was seen scolding him on camera, but that she had no regrets about taking action against the accused groper. Speaking with People magazine, she said that she reacted instinctively after initially thinking her friend had grabbed her as a joke. When the groper's hand traveled too far, she realized it wasn't a joke and that she'd been accosted by a stranger. Holden claimed that Cherwinski tried telling police that he was innocently trying to move the waitress out of the way as he walked past, but the surveillance video spoke for itself. The footage went viral, and Holden used her newfound internet fame to spread the message that women have a right to defend themselves when someone invades their personal space. She also used the media attention she received as an opportunity to give back to the community by raising more than $18,000 for local cat shelters. Number 3. Michael Arnold. 42-year-old Cassandra Willis unfortunately learned the hard way that it's very difficult to have a stalker properly held accountable for their actions in the US, and more particularly in New York State. She told the Vermont-based Bennington Banner that she met her alleged stalker, 65-year-old Michael Arnold, in 2019 when he became a regular customer at her restaurant in Schuylerville. Soon enough, she began receiving harassing and threatening emails containing inappropriate photos of a man who appeared to be Arnold, along with aerial images of her house. In 2020, Willis received a package containing a threatening letter, along with photos and addresses of her loved ones, and a warning that karma would soon be delivered. Arnold was charged with harassment, but the case was dismissed in exchange for his agreement to stay out of trouble, and Willis was given an order of protection. A social media account believed to belong to Arnold continued posting slanderous and intimidating content about Willis, but the district attorney hesitated to pursue additional charges for what he called a gray area when it comes to determining whether the posts violated the protective order. Willis said that when the restraining order expired, Arnold's stalking escalated to taking photos of her while sitting outside her business and home. He also allegedly began flying his plane in circles over her house at all hours of the day. In 2023, Arnold was charged with stalking. He was released on bail with orders to have no contact with Willis, and he was banned from flying. But the prohibited contact and the incessant flyovers continued, according to the victim. A few months later, Vermont authorities charged Arnold with 2 felonies and 3 misdemeanors, including aggravated stalking with court order violation, violation of an abuse prevention order, and giving false information to the police. And less than a day later, he was charged in New York with 9 new counts, including felony aggravated contempt of court. But he's currently out on bail while awaiting his next court date. Willis is understandably aggravated, exhausted, and at her wits' end with the situation. She said she lives in constant fear that something bad will happen to her and that justice won't be served. Speaking to the Bennington Banner, Arnold chalked the situation up to a misunderstanding and called Willis crazy. He's scheduled to return to court in New York in December 2023. Number 2. Chrissy Teigen. American swimsuit model, wife to singer John Legend, cookbook author and TV personality Chrissy Teigen has long been known for her unapologetic social media posts. But while she branded her behavior as an admirable form of blunt honesty, many felt that her attitude was excessively snarky, conceited, and in some cases downright mean. Teigen's in-your-face persona came back to haunt her in 2021 when model and reality show star Courtney Stodden called her out for cyberbullying. Stodden claimed that Teigen began tormenting her relentlessly in 2011 after she infamously married a 50-year-old acting coach when she was still a teenager. While many people mocked and ridiculed Stodden, the now 29-year-old accused Teigen of being particularly cruel in a series of tweets and direct messages, which included statements encouraging Stodden to self-harm. In an Instagram video posted in 2021, Stodden admonished Teigen for being not only mean, but vicious at a time when the troubled young woman needed help, if anything. The allegations went viral, and a backlash against Teigen was massive. Her cookware line was promptly pulled from shelves at Macy's stores and removed from the company's website, and she lost a partnership deal with Bloomingdale's. Teigen apologized for her past behavior in a lengthy Twitter thread, describing herself as an insecure, attention-seeking troll. She admitted feeling embarrassed and asked for an opportunity to own up to her past mistakes and seek self-improvement and change. Stodden accepted Teigen's apology, but she doubted the bully's sincerity, speculating that the remorseful words were mainly an attempt to mitigate the damage to Teigen's career. In the wake of the controversy, several others came forward with cyberbullying allegations against Teigen, including fashion designer Michael Costello and former Teen Mom star Farrah Abraham. The scandal has since died down in the media, and while Teigen remains active on social media, she appears to be taking a less catty tone with her words. Number 1. Murtaza Ahmed. After his girlfriend broke up with him in 2022, 32-year-old Murtaza Ahmed refused to accept that the relationship was over. When pleading with the woman to take him back didn't work, Ahmed tried bullying his ex into keeping him in her life. The aggressive behavior only worsened as Ahmed repeatedly showed up uninvited at his ex's house in Oxford, England. During one of these unwanted visits, the disgruntled ex-boyfriend chased after the victim, grabbed her and pulled her hair in an attempt to stop her from leaving as she tried getting into her car. The woman managed to fight Ahmed off and drove to her mom's house. But when she returned home later on, she found the property ransacked with her underwear torn to shreds and ripped pages of the Kama Sutra lying around. There was also a series of notes about what the woman had been up to recently and who she was spending her time with, making it clear that Ahmed was keeping close tabs on her. Prosecutor Nick Mather said that the materials found inside the woman's home were meant to humiliate her and possibly make her feel too embarrassed to report Ahmed's crimes to the police. But she did go to the police, and Ahmed ultimately pleaded guilty to burglary, causing actual bodily harm, stalking, and criminal damage. He apologized in court, blaming his behavior on alcohol and vowing to change his ways, but was still sentenced to 27 months in prison. Ahmed was also strictly banned from contacting the victim for 8 years. Number 8. Paul Woodward. A British woman suffered in silence at the hands of her toxic partner, 34-year-old Paul Woodward. He isolated her from her loved ones, controlled her every move, berated her, and physically abused her. Woodward was initially kind toward the woman, but became increasingly possessive and cruel over time. He allegedly made the woman delete her social media, called her disparaging names, made her choose between him and her children, and forced her to go to work with him to make sure she wasn't cheating. In 2021, Woodward ordered his girlfriend to end a phone call with her daughter and choked her unconscious when she refused. The woman became so scared for her safety that she jumped out of Woodward's moving van. Woodward forced her back into the vehicle, but she managed to call her daughter for help. The victim's leg was seriously injured, requiring surgery to repair the damage. She eventually mustered the strength to leave the relationship, and Woodward was arrested for abusing her. He accused the woman of making everything up, but the court was unswayed by his claims. Woodward was convicted of causing actual bodily harm and engaging in controlling and coercive behavior in an intimate relationship, and was sentenced to 4 years and 4 months in prison. Number 7. Mom calls daughter out. In 2014, a mom's controversial decision to shame her daughter for cyberbullying went viral, sparking intense debates over whether the unusual punishment made her an awesome parent or a terrible parent. She posted a photo of her daughter holding a sign that said, "My name is Haley. I am a kind, caring, smart girl, but I make poor choices with social media." The sign further stated that Haley was selling her iPod as a punishment and donating the proceeds to an anti-bullying non-profit. The image first appeared on Reddit, where many people commented that they felt the mother's punishment was overly harsh and that it constituted a form of bullying itself. Others took a less critical stance, including one Redditor who credited the mom with describing his daughter as kind, smart and caring on the sign rather than calling the girl a bully. And in the eyes of some, it was good enough that the mother was trying to steer her daughter away from bullying rather than condoning it or turning a blind eye. Number 6. Edmund Aviv. When 4 separate criminal convictions failed to stop 62-year-old Edmund Aviv from continuing to bully members of his community, Ohio Judge Gail Williams Byers imposed an unconventional but highly effective punishment that included very little jail time. According to court records, Aviv tormented his neighbor Sandra Prue and her family over a 15-year period starting in the late 1990s. Some of Prue's earliest complaints included allegations that Aviv jogged past her and spat on her on at least 2 occasions while she was planting flowers outside her home in South Euclid. Aviv also allegedly targeted Prue's 2 disabled African-American children with racial slurs and other insults, threw dog feces on the family's car and wheelchair ramp, and frequently erupted into unprovoked, rage-filled tantrums when he saw the family outside. In 2010, Aviv sued Prue because he disliked the smell of downy fabric softener coming from the family's dry vent. Shortly after a judge threw the case out, Prue accused Aviv of dumping fabric softener all over her lawn. The ongoing feud eventually reached a point where the Prues felt unsafe in their own home, but did not have the resources to move after having the house modified to accommodate the children's wheelchairs. Aviv's 5th arrest came in 2013 when he allegedly blew kerosene fumes onto the Prues' property, causing one of Sandra's children to get sick. In his garage, police discovered a homemade contraption linking a large fan to a kerosene supply. He pleaded no contest to a 4th-degree misdemeanor charge of disorderly conduct. Apparently fed up with Aviv's behavior, Judge Gail Williams Byers tried a new approach to punishing him for his actions. In addition to 15 days in jail and 7 months of probation, she ordered Aviv to sit on a busy street corner for 5 straight hours, holding a sign that stated, "I am a bully. I pick on children that are disabled, and I am intolerant of those that are different from myself." The sign had to be visible from at least 25 feet away, and a bailiff stood nearby the entire time to ensure that Aviv completed his full punishment. Dozens of people honked their car horns, yelled insults, and tried talking to Aviv as he carried out the shameful display. He was mostly unresponsive and refused to answer questions, but accused Judge Williams Byers of ruining his life in a brief statement to reporters. In addition to holding the sign, Aviv was required to write an apology letter to Prue and attend anger management and counseling. He was also warned that if he continued to harass the Prues, he would face more jail time. Number 5. Aaron Cusack. Just days after being promoted in 2021, a British police officer of 5 years named Aaron Cusack was accused of pressuring a woman to drop an assault complaint against another man. According to investigators, 27-year-old Guernsey police detective Aaron Cusack had previous interactions with the accuser, which he never disclosed to his superiors throughout the investigation of her complaint. Detectives began to suspect that Cusack had possibly sent an inappropriate photo of himself to the woman after her social worker relayed some troubling statements that the victim had made. In an apparent effort to keep himself out of the hot seat, he drove to the woman's house without following proper police protocols for interacting with a vulnerable victim and tried persuading her to drop the case. Cusack allegedly told the woman that she would put herself at risk of legal trouble if she continued to pursue the complaint. A judge would later describe bodycam footage of the conversation as highly disturbing, while also remarking on the victim's impressionable nature. According to police, Cusack went through the woman's phone at the police department in search of any incriminating material against him before turning it over to the agency's high-tech crime unit for further examination. In doing so, he directly violated the department's policy, which dictated that the phone should go straight to the high-tech crime unit. The disgraced cop also refused to give investigators the passcodes to his phone, tablet, and laptop. Cusack was fired during the investigation and was eventually charged with 3 counts of failing to disclose information and 1 count of perverting the course of justice. He pleaded guilty, claiming in court that he withheld the passwords out of a fear of professional embarrassment. In his own words, he said that privacy meant more than his job. Once known as a well-respected and upstanding member of his police department, Cusack now found himself in the exact opposite position of facing prison time. He was sentenced to 2.5 years behind bars, which included an 18-month sentence for perverting the course of justice and a year for refusing to share his device passcodes. Number 4. Derek Wayne Bowers. In early 2023, U.S. federal authorities arrested 44-year-old Derek Wayne Bowers of Hagerstown, Maryland, for stalking his ex-girlfriend from Morgan County, West Virginia, following their breakup the previous year. Bowers was accused of harassing and intimidating the woman in violation of a protective order and using social media to damage her business and embarrass her. He allegedly texted the victim more than 2,000 times over a 6-month period and called her 815 times in just 48 hours. The accused stalker pleaded guilty as charged 4 months after his arrest and faces up to 5 years in prison. He appears to be awaiting sentencing. In a statement, U.S. Attorney William Illenfeld described cyberstalking as a pervasive problem. He reassured the public that authorities in West Virginia took cyberstalking very seriously and encouraged anyone who was suffering emotional distress from being intimidated online to file a police report. Number 3. The France Telecom scandal. In a case of what was later described as institutional harassment, top-ranking officials of the French telecommunications company France Telecom sought to cut costs and eliminate jobs by creating a culture of workplace bullying and intimidation. With a $50 billion debt looming over their heads due to the recent privatization of the corporation, Chief Executive Didier Lombard and 2 other company bigwigs aimed to get rid of at least 22,000 employees. But because most of France Telecom's 120,000 employees were civil servants, they were protected from being fired. Starting in 2008, Lombard and his accomplices, second-in-command Louis-Pierre Venez and former Human Sources Director Olivier Barbaro, took measures to drastically worsen the working conditions in hopes of driving people to quit their jobs. The trio allegedly pushed employees into job positions they were unqualified for, relocated them hundreds of miles away from their families, stopped giving them meaningful work, and systematically harassed workers. Many employees were suddenly removed from their usual workspace without explanation and relegated to office conditions that felt like a punishment compared to what they were used to. Others were given very little training and then flung into jobs that they didn't really know how to do, while being forced to work extremely long hours with inadequate breaks. The impact of these behaviors on France Telecom's workforce was so damaging that many, if not most, of the employees experienced life-altering stress, anxiety, and depression. For dozens of people, the suffering was so great that it triggered their deaths in one way or another. Many workers who had planned to stay with the company until their retirement and had never envisioned being put through such misery fell into such deep despair and hopelessness that they didn't think they would ever recover from it. In 2010, the problems at France Telecom became headline news. Lombard resigned from his post shortly thereafter, and Venez and Barbaro soon followed suit. The 3 men and 4 other suspects were criminally charged with institutional moral harassment. When their trial finally rolled around in 2019, the former executives argued that they were acting under the pressure of the highly competitive and rapidly changing market. But the court was unswayed by their claims, and the trio were convicted as charged. They were each sentenced to 4 months in prison and fined $16,000, and the company itself was slapped with an $83,000 fine. Number 2. Richard Anthony Kenny. A 49-year-old Michigan man named Richard Anthony Kenny became the first Kent County resident to be charged with cyberbullying in December 2019. The arrest came just 9 months after the cyberbullying statute went into effect in the state. Kenny was accused of posting a photo of the 3 Stooges on social media, with his face photoshopped onto one of the Stooges who was holding a bomb in his hand. It was accompanied by a caption hinting at a specific person and an alleged desire to cause the victim to fear bodily harm or death. While the nature of Kenny's relationship with the victim is unclear, property records obtained by MLive.com showed that the 2 parties lived in the same neighborhood. The Kent County Sheriff's Office described Kenny and the victim as acquaintances who disliked each other. Kenny's cyberbullying charge came 2 months after he was arrested for allegedly blowing up a can of butane lighter fluid in his neighbor's yard. According to police, he detonated the explosive to wake up the neighbor in an act of revenge for a prior incident. At the time of his cyberbullying arrest, he was awaiting trial on a charge of possessing an explosive device with malicious intent, which can carry a sentence of up to 15 years in prison. Kenny's lawyer denied that his client meant any harm with the Three Stooges post. He chalked it up to a joke and accused the person who had him arrested of trying to send a message. The outcomes of Kenny's cases are unclear. September 2010, a Rutgers University student named Dharun Ravi secretly recorded webcam footage of his male roommate Tyler Clementi kissing a man at their apartment in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Knowing that Clementi was not out of the closet about his interest in men, Ravi shared images of the encounter with a group of students from their college. Being outed before he was ready triggered a series of events that led to Clementi's untimely death just a few days later. In a series of Facebook messages to Clementi, Ravi claimed that he had accidentally left his webcam on and that he had no ill intentions. He also told Clementi that he had no problem with him being gay and chalked the incident up to a petty misunderstanding. But it was too late to fix the situation, and the evidence, which included text messages, witness accounts, and social media posts, suggested that Ravi's actions were deliberate. Authorities charged Ravi with 15 criminal counts, including hate crime charges. He was found guilty of invasion of privacy, hindering apprehension, witness tampering, and 4 counts of bias, intimidation, and took a plea deal which came with a month in jail, 3 years of probation, a $10,000 fine, and mandatory counseling. Ravi's conviction was dropped in early 2016 after a court ruled that the bias intimidation laws he was convicted under were unconstitutional. To avoid another trial, he took a deal and pleaded guilty to 1 felony count of attempted invasion of privacy. He was sentenced to time served, which felt like a far cry from justice for many who felt that he deserved a much heavier punishment. But the publicity the case received served as its own form of punishment, ensuring that Ravi's actions would never be forgotten and that Tyler Clementi's story would get the airplay it deserved in the fight against anti-gay bullying. Thanks for watching. Would you rather enjoy the satisfaction of seeing your former high school bully doing terribly in life, or the peace of being able to put the past behind you and get along as adults? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.